Good afternoon. On behalf of the Inter-American Development Bank, we welcome you to the event, Market Creating Innovations in the Pandemic, a conversation with Efosa Ojomo, co-author of The Prosperity Paradox, together with Ana Maria Rodriguez Ortiz, Vice President for Sectors and Knowledge, and Irene Arias, Chief Executive Officer of IDB Lab. The event will be in English, with interpretation available in Spanish. Para escuchar el evento en español, haga clic en el icono del mundo que encontrará en la parte baja de su pantalla y seleccione el idioma de español. Please submit your questions through the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Irene, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Irene Arias, CEO of IDB Lab, the innovation laboratory of the Inter-American Development Bank. Welcome to this virtual session on market creating innovations and the pandemic. It will be a conversation with Efosa Ojomo and Ana Maria Rodriguez. And I'll introduce briefly Efosa, who he may be soft-spoken and appears very modest, but he is one of 30 global thinkers of people leading market ideas, management ideas. And this is according to the 2020 Thinkers 50 list. He's also the author of The Prosperity Paradox, a book that he wrote with the late Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen. And he researches and writes about how innovation can transform organizations and create inclusive prosperity. And this is why at IDB Lab we've connected over the years so much with him and his work, since we try to put in practice a lot of what is contained in the Prosperity Paradox. Efosa leads the Global Prosperity Research Group at the Clayton Christensen Institute for Disruptive Innovation, an innovation-focused think tank based in Boston and Silicon Valley. And we're very thankful for Ana Maria joining us today. Ana Maria Rodriguez Ortiz is the Vice President of Sectors and Knowledge at the IDB Group. And we will hear from her in a second. Thank you, Ana Maria, and thank you, Efosa, and everyone for joining us today.
Thank you very much. I was checking that I'm not on mute. Actually, the one that is has to thank you is myself, because this is a super opportunity, because I have been following the things that Efosa Ojomo is doing. And I know that you presented him and you did an excellent job in doing so, but I have to mention a couple of things. As has been said already, Efosa is a senior research fellow at the Institute for Disruptive Innovation. His recent book with Clayton Christensen is called The Prosperity Paradox, but the idea is how innovation can lift nations out of poverty. And he has a TED Talk on innovation and corruption that has more than 1.8 million views. So if you see, in 30 minutes in this talk, I have mentioned innovation already 3 times. And that is not a coincidence, because I'm actually right on target by saying innovation 3 times, because Efosa proposal and what he writes and what he preaches and what he practices is all about innovation. Innovation where? In jobs, on poverty, on prosperity, I don't know, in happiness. You pick whatever topic and said, look for innovation, look for innovation. But he also says something that I think is what makes the whole thing different. He said, but to think of innovation, but not just any innovation, because not all innovation are, say, born equal or designed equally. And he really called our attention on 3 types of innovation. One, that is market creating innovations, and it's market creating innovations that pull people from non-consumption into consumption. So it's check this, it's not poverty into richness, it's into non-consumption to consumption, and what is the circle, virtuous circle that creates on that. The second innovation is sustaining innovations, targeting existing consumption. And the third one is efficiency innovations that enable companies to do more with less. So we have three types of innovation: the market creating innovation, the one that sustains innovation, and the other ones that create efficiency innovations. So one of the things that I love on his work is there a tension between push or pull strategies for development? And that brings him very much into what we do both at the IDB lab, at the IDB and the IDB group. Should we think on push strategies for development or pull strategies for development? And let me put it in a different way. Should we look into alleviating poverty or creating prosperity? And I think that change of question, how my development is going to be think of, is going to be completely transformational if we tackle this question on terms not of alleviating poverty, that is not the frame of mind, but make sure that you create prosperity. And I think that is what makes him so interesting for what we do and really changes the way we think about what we can accomplish. So the good thing is that what is the question? How might the development community be transformed us if we simply ask not the first question, alleviating poverty, by the second? And the good thing on that question is that Efosa has the answer to us. Thank you, Efosa, so much for being here. I'm very proud, very thankful for the invitation, but very, very happy actually to have you here firsthand and have the opportunity to put some questions, not only mine, but the ones of the audience. So make sure that you put the question here. Efosa, with that, over to you.
Thank you so much, Irene. Thank you, Ana Maria. It's truly a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm gonna just share a few ideas with you today from our book that really talk about the power of market creating innovation. And I think it's really hard to not talk about the pandemic when you think about what's going on in the world today. So I'm not gonna focus a lot on the pandemic, but I'll just mention a little bit about how it's impacting our world and impacting a lot of the work that all of you are doing. My hope is that you come away from this, our time together today with, at the very least, some new language and new frameworks for how to think about innovation, think about poverty, prosperity, and a lot of the work that you're doing. But before we actually begin, I have a pop quiz. You know, if we were all in class, I would have had, you know, cold called somebody or said, raise your hand. But first question on the pop quiz is, you know, roughly how much do you think the Colombian government spends per citizen every year? Right, every year, every government in the world, they figure out a budget and they say, we're gonna spend this much on education, on infrastructure, on healthcare, and so on. And this question is essentially getting at how much do you think the Colombian government, when they take all the money they said they're gonna spend, they look at all the people living in Colombia, how much do you think they spend per year, per person? Okay, think about the answer. You have 5 options. And so the answer is A. Roughly $15.85 US per person. I'll tell you why that's important. I think it's very important because when we look at many emerging economies, right, middle income countries, low income countries, we often look at the government for everything or for most solutions. We look at the government to build all the roads and bridges and infrastructure, to build all the schools and essentially root out corruption and to do defense, national defense, security, and so on and so forth. But when you take a step back and look at how much money the government has to help it accomplish a lot of these things that that they are tasked with, that they are supposed to do, you begin to get an idea that maybe they don't have enough of the resources to do it. It does not absolve them of the responsibility. That's an entirely different conversation. What we're trying to establish now is how much do they have in their budget to do all the things we want and hope that they will do. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, that's where international development comes in. That's where, you know, the World Bank, you know, the Inter-American Development Bank, that's where all these banks come in. Well, it turns out that those help a little bit, but they can't even fill the gap. So in the average Latin American country, for instance, or the typical Latin American country, on average, official development assistance, right, per person is about $16. So when you look at all the money that the region gets, you know, all the development dollars divided by how many people live there, it's about $16 per person. I think Colombia is about 36. And so we begin to get an appreciation for the lack of resources and the importance of innovation. Okay, I wanted to start there just to anchor us so that we appreciate the importance of innovation in the work that we do. And that's really where my beloved professor comes in. I'll read the quote he has here because I think it's one of the most important quotes, and it's really how he lived his life and did his work. He said, in any organization that I've been associated with, if they are struggling to make a decision and make progress, it's because they don't have a common language and a common way to frame the problem. And my hope is that today we can begin to have common language and a common way to frame some of the problems of development, some of the problems associated with poverty, and helping lift people out of poverty and create prosperity. The first thing I want to talk about today is the idea of consumption and non-consumption. You see, in every economy, we often think about it as just a hodgepodge, a big combination of different things: government, education sector, healthcare, infrastructure, institutions, private sector. There's just so much going on. But one of the things Clay taught me was, you know, let's simplify it and divide the economy into consumption and non-consumption. And so this is a very simple representation, right, of an economy. There are three circles. In the smallest circle, you have the fewest number of people, but they often have the most amount of wealth, the most amount of access, the most amount of skill. They are, some people may say, they are the elite in society. And then as the circle gets bigger, you have more and more people with fewer and fewer resources. Well, it turns out that almost always when a new industry or new product emerges, that new product is always targeted at the people at the smallest circle, largely because it costs a lot of money, right, to develop this new product, and you target it to the people who can most pay for it, or the people who have the most access to skill, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, it doesn't mean that all the other people in the economy don't have a need for these products, don't struggle in their lives if they don't have access to the products. But what it means is there are no products and services available on the market that has them in mind. There are no products and services available that takes their struggles into consideration and that they can afford so that their lives can improve. The reason for this, right, is there are typically 4 barriers to consumption, 4 barriers to converting non-consumption into consumption. The first barrier is access. It just means the product is not available in my vicinity, in my area. And a good example of this is, I'm originally from Nigeria, and before the pandemic, whenever our president got sick, seriously ill, he would leave the country to go to Germany to get healthcare. Now, there are doctors in Nigeria. He had money. That wasn't the issue. The issue was his illness. There was just no healthcare available to take care of it for him. So he had to leave. Now imagine all the people in Nigeria who had similar ailments and couldn't leave, right? They weren't part of the small circle that I just showed that he's a part of. It doesn't mean they love to be sick. It just means they don't have the access. The second one is time. When we have products and services that take way too much time to consume, we're going to have a lot of people not consuming those products and services. A funny example here is, since the pandemic started, I spent some time at my in-laws' houses, and my wife noticed that I always drank 2 cups of coffee when I was there, but when we were at home, I drank only 1 cup of coffee. Well, it turns out we had a different coffee maker. We had a French press. It took 15, 20 minutes to make a cup of coffee. I had to wash it. And at their house, they had a Keurig machine. It literally took 5 seconds to put the thing in, push a button. That was not an issue of money. It was an issue of time. It took too much time for me to consume. The third one is money. And I think this is the most obvious one. And it's often the one we think about, but it's not the only one, because you can have people have access to money, or you can even have products be free, but there are other barriers that prevent people from consuming. And the last one is skill, where people just don't have the skill needed to actually use the product. And the example I give there, and we write about this in our book, is a company called MicroInsure. MicroInsure developed an insurance product that they were really giving out for free to people who used certain mobile phone suppliers, mobile telecommunication suppliers. And they asked people 3 questions. What is your name, your date of birth, and your next of kin? If you were able to answer those questions, you got essentially access to free life insurance. 80% of people, when they got to that step, they dropped out, because some of them were like, I don't know exactly what day, like when I was born. And I'm sure some of you can relate with the work you do and some of the communities you serve. They don't know exactly what day. Some of them said, my next of kin, I don't really know who that is, right? I don't want to get this wrong, or if I get it, I don't want to upset someone. And so that was a free product, but it didn't take into consideration the struggle that non-consumers were going through. And as a result, 80% dropped out. And so the company fundamentally changed how they delivered that product to people. So it's important to keep all these barriers in mind. Now, those are barriers to consumption. When we think about what's going on with COVID-19, I'm sure you're familiar with these statistics. I'll just list out a few, and then I think it's fairly easy to say non-consumption will increase in the region, right? So right now, unfortunately, over 1 million cases. I think many of those are in Brazil, but over 1 million cases in the region. Estimated contraction of the economy is at 5.3%. The truth is, we don't really know. We don't really know what's going to happen. At least I don't. These are just numbers that I got from a UN report. 30 million people, right, will slide into poverty, and 16 million, so that's national poverty, which is different from extreme poverty, where roughly 16 million people are estimated to slide into extreme poverty, less than $2 a day, right? These are human beings, lives that are impacted by this. 38 million people roughly will lose their jobs. Again, this is what we know for now. Some of these numbers might get better, hopefully, some might get worse. The thing that we know, regardless of what these numbers are or what they end up being, here's what we know. We know the number of people in that bigger circle, if we call them the ones who have the least access to money, to skill, to time, right? They are going to increase. We all can agree on that. COVID-19 is not making a majority of us wealthier. If anything, it's making a majority of us poorer and have less access. And as it is with any crisis, it hits the most vulnerable and the poorest amongst us the most. And so I think I want to really stress this, because if your work was important before COVID-19, it is way more important today. If innovation was important before COVID-19, when we looked at access to government budgets and resources, official development assistance, before COVID-19, where budgets are now going to be stretched, it's way more important today. Innovation is way more important. And so I want to challenge you that if the work you're doing, and please take this in good spirits, if the work you're doing looks the same as the work you were doing before COVID-19, you're not pushing yourself hard enough. You're not pushing yourself hard enough, okay? And so you want to challenge yourself going forward. Your work has to look a little bit different because we know non-consumption is going to increase. But when we talk about non-consumption and innovation, what do we mean? I'll give you a quick example here. 70, 80 years ago, if you look at computing, they were very big, filled huge rooms, and cost a lot of money, required really technical people to manage them. Over time, what happened in that industry wasn't that we all got wealthy enough to afford mainframe computers, right? You see that? Computers came down and met us where we are. And so most of us now have computers in our pockets that we carry around. And so these types of innovations, where a product or a service that's only available to the few in society that have access to money, to time, skill, and so on. These types of innovations that make those products and services simple and affordable so that many other people in these bigger circles can afford them are called market creating innovations. I love how Ana Maria actually started. In fact, I was gonna say she could help me go through the whole presentation. Did such a good job laying it out. Okay, and so the thing that I'd love for you to really take away from this particular image here is we did not get wealthy enough to afford mainframe computers. Instead, market creating innovators developed products, computers that we could afford. And in creating those new markets, they created a ton of jobs. It helped us become a lot more productive. We could essentially get to a more prosperous society. And that's why not all innovation is created equal. And the first type I've talked about, right? It's market creating. You take a complicated and expensive product, you make it simple and affordable, many more people can get access to it. This creates jobs, enables development, and is really critical to create prosperity. The second type, sustaining innovations, they make good products better. They typically target at existing customers. The thing about them though is they're good, but they don't really create a ton of jobs. And from a development standpoint, it's fairly neutral. I'll give you a quick example here is if you think about, say, a phone company, when they add a new camera, a better camera to a phone, they don't need an entirely new distribution channel. They don't need a new sales channel. They don't need new sales offices, an entirely new manufacturing plant to sell that product, right? They leverage the existing assets and resources they have. And so they may hire a few people here or there, but because they're serving the existing consumers, consumption, they are not going to be creating a ton of new jobs and having significant impact. And the third type are efficiency innovations. Now, efficiency innovations are also important because if you don't do them, your competitors are going to leave you behind. But these innovations enable you to do more with less. Now that's ordinarily, that's good. However, because you're serving, again, existing consumers, what ultimately happens is these eliminate jobs. And so when you do a lot of resource extraction industries, right, the average manager in that industry is looking at removing cost from their operations because they're selling a commodity product that they don't manage the price on. And so, you know, go to any country that has a lot of resources, they're not looking to those industries to create tens of thousands of jobs. Those industries release cash flows. And if those cash flows can be pumped back into market creating innovations, you can really have a beautiful cycle of development happen. So I just want to end with a few examples here, especially examples in the region, right, that we can look to. The first, Clínicas del Azúcar in Mexico, and this is a chain of diabetes clinics. The average cost to treat diabetes in the US is roughly $19,000 a year. In Mexico is $16,000, sorry. In Mexico it's about $1,000 or so. Many people who have this disease can't afford it. An entrepreneur named Javier Lozano develops a chain of diabetes clinics and reduces the price from roughly $1,000 to about $250. But not just that, because of the way diabetes impacts all of like the people who have them, you might need to see an eye doctor. Some people go blind. You might need to see a foot specialist. People have had amputations. You might need to see a nutritionist, an endocrinologist to manage your hormones and so on. So you have all these different specialists that you have to go from one clinic to another. And so remember the barriers to consumption, right? Access, time, skill. So you have to manage that. So he said, I'm not just going to focus on cost. I'm going to focus on the other barriers as well. And so he has created a one-stop shop clinic where patients can get diabetes care for a fraction of the cost. Another example is Iguana Fix. I'm pretty sure many of you can tell me how difficult it is to get small or medium or micro businesses to become part of the formal economy, and they become tax-paying citizens, and we can get easier access to data. It's really hard to do that. Iguana Fix has developed a marketplace that's developed the incentives so that home improvement and service providers are actually incentivized to sign up and become formal. And he did this by making sure that when they become part of this platform, there's predictability in the kind of work they get. There's ease of getting paid. They get access to much bigger jobs. And so they're happy to sign on, pay taxes, and be a part of the formal economy. That was really a consequence, right? That wasn't why they signed up. They signed up because they struggled, right, with predictability of jobs and so on and so forth. And so I think rethinking how we design and develop solutions is helpful. And the last is Nubank, which I'm sure you're familiar with, where they've created a solution that essentially takes banking to your phone, and they're targeting a lot of non-consumers. I think one of the things I want to highlight is if you look at all these solutions here, they did not target the folks in the smallest circle. They're really trying to target the non-consumers, make their products and services affordable for as many people as possible in society, so that those people can go from non-consumption to consumption. As a consequence of that, because you're serving so many more people, you're going to need more people to make the product, to sell the product, service the product. So you essentially create jobs, and that serves as a really strong foundation for development. As you begin to pay taxes, then you also see institutions over time become better. One of the things that we are hoping to do at the Institute is take a lot of this and sort of put it together in a boot camp where we can share these ideas with specific case studies, some of the ones I just mentioned, that can help a lot of entrepreneurs, but also a lot of people in the space working to make life better for others, think very differently about innovation and the role of innovation in creating prosperity for a lot of people. So if this is of interest, please definitely reach out and let me know. I'm speeding through the last few slides here, but I always end my presentations on with this slide. As Irene and Ana Maria mentioned, Professor Christensen was my professor when I was in business school, and unfortunately he passed away in January of this year. This is one of the last trips he took. We were in South Africa together and giving a talk to the Harvard Business School Alumni Association down there. And the reason I show this slide is to remind me, to remind you, all the folks I speak with, of what the most important thing he taught me is. It wasn't about innovation. It wasn't about writing a book. It was about how I'm going to measure my life. He wrote a book in 2010 called How Will You Measure Your Life? And he said, Efosa, the way you measure your life is by the people you help to become better people. And I can confidently say he helped me become a better person. And I want to relay that to all of you, right? In the work that you do with the people who work for you, the people you work with, your peers, how are you helping them become better people? And even extending to your family, your spouse, your siblings, your brother, your kids. Are you the kind of person who, when people encounter, however much time they spend with you, they become better and richer people as a result? Professor Christensen did that for me and gave me opportunities beyond my wildest dreams. My hope is that in the short time I've spent with you today, I'm able to do that a little bit. And I hope you all go out and do that with all the people in your life as well. So I want to thank you for listening today. Really appreciate this invitation, and it's been my utmost pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Efosa, for a very sharp, precise presentation. That it really brings us to the point of this non-consumption and consumption that I like so much. And I was taking some notes here and thinking, well, you talk about access, time, money, and skill. And one of the things that I was thinking of, there's so many things and services that you can put on that particular bucket that are urgent. And you tend to think about consumerism in a way, but you're talking about water. You're talking about water, how you bring water, because it is difficult to access in some communities. It's very time consuming going from one point to the other. It could be super expensive to pay the price of not using the time and working, and maybe the skill of taking the water or protect the well is huge. And as I was thinking so many things in which you think, why don't we think about how to bring these people and give them the access, the time, the money, and the skill? I was thinking so much in one thing that the COVID-19 has put so much like in a big lens, which is something that in itself is something that leverages your ability to do and create new solutions, which is digital access. And it's amazing how, of course, in different parts of the world it's different, but Latin America and the Caribbean has left some behind. And the question is access. Do you have access? And you find access is not only about connection, which is one, but it's money. Access is, can you pay it? And something that I love is, do you have the skill? So it's not enough to have the outlet, so you connect yourself. Do you have been provided with the skill to manage this? And this is some of the things that really bring things to life. I said, if you really create an army of people that can talk on digital, that can access digital, you're opening a lot of consumers for a lot of things that are critical. Not minor. I was thinking on the digital, for example, in a very strange way, talking with people in Estonia, they said, you know, for us, putting tax on people is a service. I anticipate that they want to pay because they want to get the services. But why not make their life very easy? So you pay with easy access. You don't spend a lot of time. You really get the skills to interact with government and actually use the fact that you're clear about what you're paying to demand some services. Which I think the beauty of this concept extends from water to taxes, or in the case of China, how China in a very very short period of time, actually they jump over from cash money into digital. And it is nowadays you can buy products in the street digitally, but honestly, people selling bananas or oranges in the street, and then actually one time I saw somebody giving some support to a poor blind person with the digital. So I think discovering not only the possibilities, but the quality of where is the quality of the consumption that you wanted to bring, and I think is very, very powerful. The other thing that I have to admit that really moved me a lot is the concept of measure of life. That I think I hope the IDB in general tries to do, but it's also not only an institutional challenge or opportunity, it's an individual opportunity. I think the minute that you bring that over, instead of you feeling yourself generous and making the life of others better, is the being proud about actually seeing them succeed by themselves. So I think really is spectacular. We have very, very interesting questions that I wanted to raise to you. One that is very good that I like very much. I said, okay, you have investors and they're going to start expanding these services or goods, but they are very hesitant because they don't know exactly if these guys that you're trying to target as consumers now actually will react. They don't know. It's very hard to know that market if that has not been developed. How you can work that out, how you can make sure that these investors that are willing to try these things do understand this concept, not the one of, and so it's not only, development is not only about helping poor people, but it's bringing prosperity. But you need the investors to think that this is what they are bringing. So that would be my first question for you, and thank you again for a spectacular presentation.
Yes, thank you, and that's thanks for the beautiful summary. And whoever asked that question, I appreciate that, because not only is it a good question, but it's an important question. If we don't get the investment community looking at non-consumers as significant markets that have not yet been created, significant opportunity, then it's going to take us a very long time. It's going to take us a long time. And so it cuts to the importance of what we're doing and where we want to get to. If you look at the flow of FDI, you know, the OECD countries, you know, America, the EU, and, you know, Japan, a few others, they account for over 70–75% of FDI when you just look at how much money they get, because investors are thinking there's a lot of opportunity there, and a majority of others don't. So it's a good question. I think one of the things I'll answer with sort of three main answers here, 3 parts. The first is emerging economies are at a different level than I would say wealthier, prosperous countries today, which means the investment opportunities and what you have to do will look different. It doesn't mean there are no opportunities. And so I can't invest in the same way, right, and expecting the same kinds of reaction from the market that I would in, say, Colombia and the United States. And the way we try to explain that in our book is say, okay, let's go back to the United States when the United States had similar demographics as many emerging economies today. And what you find is, it's not that there were a lot of non-consumers, there was a lot of poverty, but the investors invested in a particular type of way. And so I give you an example of Henry Ford, right? He made cars simple and affordable, made it possible for many people to drive at the time. Cars were very expensive. In order to do that, right, he had to invest in gas stations, steel mills, iron ore mines, glass factories, paint factories. You don't have to do that today in the US. If you look at Isaac Singer, who's another American innovator, he had to invest in some of these other components that were different from his core product, which was sewing machines. Even when you look at Bank of America started as a bank for immigrants and really the poorest of the poor in the US, in California. And they had a different business model that targeted non-consumers. And so for us, right, I don't know the answer of how to invest, to target the average, I would say, Latin American non-consumer. But we have a framework, right? We have a way of thinking about non-consumption, and we have a set of activities that we can do that gives us a much better chance that we will create the market and be successful, right? And so that's the first thing I would say is looking at when prosperous countries, right, had similar demographics, how did investors go about creating these new markets? I can guarantee you the companies that we see that are investing in that way are making tremendous progress. The second thing I'll say really quickly is, we're doing some research now on how much does it cost for you to serve a non-consumer in an emerging economy compared with how much does it cost to serve a person in a prosperous society. The reason we're doing that comparison is a lot of capital resides in the prosperous economies. And if I spend $500 a year, for instance, on my phone bill, and the average person in Peru spends $100 a year, I might look and say there's absolutely no opportunity there, right? Because it's $500 a year, how are we going to serve them? But we're actually doing some research saying, no, there's a ton of opportunity there. There are a ton of companies making a lot of money. And so instead of looking at the absolute number, we're saying, look at the percent of income. So if I spend 5% of my income in the US and you have someone developing a product where the average Peruvian will spend 25% of their income on the same product, even though it might be less expensive, you begin to get an idea, maybe that's not going to create a new market. Maybe that's going to serve the wealthiest. And so there are these methodologies that we can use to assess. You can never predict or you can't guarantee, but these methodologies you can use to sort of give you an idea of how big the market is and your likelihood of success. And so we're working on a paper right now, actually, that outlines some of that, and we hope that it's helpful in people and sort of going after these opportunities. And the last is, look, development, investment, it's a process. You can't create a new market like tomorrow. When I look at what we enjoy in many of the prosperous countries, these are markets that have been created over decades and sometimes a couple of centuries, right? And so when I think about an opportunity in an emerging economy, I think about it through an entirely different lens, right? I think about it from the lens of the non-consumer, what the barriers to consumption are, and then that defines what I do as an organization, as an investor. And so thinking about it through the lens of the non-consumer and the struggle that they experience every day by not having access, that points to opportunity. And then the business model you develop, that's a sort of a different question. But anytime you see struggle from people in really anywhere, but in emerging economies, then that really points to a lot of opportunity.
Let me take on one question from our audience that I think is very interesting. You have the innovators, but then they operate in a particular setting of institutions or rules or lack of rules when you have corruption. How do you really move this entrepreneurship that comes about in life and bring more people into the formal sector? One of the things that happen in Latin America and the Caribbean is the informal sector is very, very large. And eventually you might say, well, if they're informal, but they're doing good business and everything, but that's good. But it's not, because actually informality prevents them actually to bring, or like, jump over and really become very solid. Have you worked on that, the issue about how you bring all these good ideas or those markets? That exactly as you pointed out, 200 years ago, 100 years ago in the US, the number of regulations and controls were very different. What dimensions of institutions should we look into to make sure that we don't corner this type of innovating ideas and we bring them into informality?
Yeah, that's another good one, because one of the things that another framing that's important is innovations often precede regulations, right? And so when you look at many of the big, I would say, institutions that have come about to help us manage certain innovations, so regulatory agencies, whether it's the Food and Drug Administration or the Securities and Exchange Commission, whatever they are, they came after an innovation was developed that was able to democratize access. So in terms of the FDA, if we focus on that, for instance, Food and Drug Administration in the US, 1903 came about. Why did it come about? It came about because a lot of innovators began developing, making meat and milk and drugs more accessible to many more people. So out of my shop in Illinois, I could develop a product that affected, 1 million Americans. And now it's like, okay, we have to begin to regulate and manage this. Many emerging economies today, unfortunately, have the regulation without the market creating innovations. And so that tends to slow down the market creating innovations. With regard to how we can go about it, I think the first thing is just to know and appreciate the relationship between innovation and regulation, right? It's regulations typically come after innovations. Once we know that, we can begin to ask ourselves, why do we need these particular regulations, right? And those questions are going to be different, or the answers, sorry, are going to be different depending on what country you're in or what region you are. But beginning to question why certain regulations are important, why certain banking regulations are important when maybe 70% of people don't have access to bank accounts and have a hard time getting access to financial services. So how do we make regulations contextual? The other one that's somewhat related to the question is this notion of formal versus informal. Right now, I don't know that there's a good reason for me, if I were an average, person in Brazil or something. It's hard for me to if I don't trust the Brazilian government, if I don't believe that they have my best interest at heart, to register my business. First of all, we have to ask ourselves, how easy is it? What are the barriers to registration? How easy is it to register this business? What are the benefits of registration, right? What would me as an innovator, what would I gain if I made myself visible and went through the hoops of paying taxes and so on? Now, this is not a moral question. It's not like whether it's right or wrong. But it's about understanding what the barriers to consuming formality, if we go consumption versus non-consumption, what are the barriers are, and how can innovation help reduce those barriers? That's why I love the company Iguana Fix, because they have a waiting list of thousands of people trying to get on the platform to register their business and become formal. because they've created a set of benefits for them when you come onto the platform, right? You get customers, jobs, you get access to much bigger jobs, more predictability, you can grow your business, access to financing. So if we begin to tie some of these things that we know the average person is likely to want to formalization, I mean, I think we're going to be telling people, please stop, stay away, stop formalizing. But we have to really think through what are the barriers and what are the benefits.
Thank you, and I think there's something very good in the frame of mind. You want more formality, think about consumption. Why more people do not consume. That's great. I think because it's not only the final product, it's even services and attitudes, or what makes them a non-consumer. I think it's very powerful. And I'm going to rephrase something that has come on, so I can round two questions in one. There's a number of our audience that ask, what are the basic conditions for to have market innovation, market-based innovation? And I remember this short story that I have to tell you, because it's a shoe company in Europe. That's the story, of course, that sent somebody to a country in Africa to sell shoes. And the guy goes to Africa and writes back, everybody here goes barefoot, there's no business here. So somebody said, but the other guy sent another guy. And the guy said, wonderful opportunity. Nobody has shoes yet. And I think this is something about frame of mind and education.
Yeah.
And one question, so that I can put two of the questions that our audience has, what the conditions, but one thing that I think is super important is how do you create the frame of mind and the education in which you don't feel that you're passive on the things that you don't have, but you have the possibility of innovation. But what are the basic conditions? And one that I wanted to put it on the table is what education will create more opportunities for people to think in these terms, and other things that you think could be absolutely indispensable.
Yeah. So So let me do the basic conditions. That's a tough question to answer. And if I were to be honest with the 201 people left here, I don't know. I don't know, not because I haven't tried to look for it. I don't know because I don't know that I can tell you, here are the 10 things you need to do, and then market creating innovations will flourish. Because I've seen market creating innovations flourish in entirely different economies. In China, where corruption till today is still running rampant. It could be a different type of corruption, but it's still running rampant. I've seen market creating innovations in economies where the government really tries to help with economic development and prosperity. So we go to South Korea. I've seen market creating innovations in democracies where you're sort of trying to figure out human rights and equality and so on and so forth. I mean, the average woman in America could not vote in the 1920s. I mean, go to Switzerland, 1970s. And so the next time you see a Swiss person, tell them, when did your country start allowing women to vote? And so I think the danger with the basic conditions is when we come up with a list of 10 things, 5 things, what we do is we get our eye off the prize and we begin to focus on pushing, you talked about push versus pull, pushing those conditions and saying, we have to make sure property rights secure 100%. We have to make sure security is secure 100%. We have to make sure we root out corruption, all these things. Everybody has access to electricity, so on and so forth. But then that is really divorced from reality, because remember how I started this talk. If the Colombian government has $1,500 a year per person, how is it going to make sure you have all those basic conditions met? And so the way I like to think about that question is, what is necessary for me to do in order to create a new market in this region, right? And obviously it would depend on whether it's you're doing food production, whether you're doing housing, whether you're doing healthcare, whatever. But if you change the question you ask, what is necessary for me, that can begin to give you an idea of how you might create a new market. And so I'll just give a quick example. If you want to go into, say, healthcare, you want to make cardiac care more accessible, but you realize there's just so much corruption in that space and I can't really afford it. That doesn't mean there aren't other businesses thriving. There aren't other healthcare businesses thriving. What it means is right now may not be the best time for you to go about that particular business. So you could look into another one. But to create this environment where everything like flourishes, that's hard because I don't know that it exists. And the research that I've seen shows that it evolves over time. When we look at the strength of institutions and democracies and how more people get rights, what we see is it's very positively correlated with the level of prosperity, right? And so it's hard to say to a emerging economy, low or middle income country, like here are all the things you should do because your economy will look like the US or France or the UK, but the US, France, the UK spend on average $20,000-$30,000 per citizen per year. You're spending $500, $1,500. So it's really tough. So I would make that question a bit more personal. What do I need to do to create this new market? And there are some predictable things I think people could do. The second framing, I think, maybe this is not a good answer, but I think getting the message out to as many people as possible that when you see people who are not wearing shoes, metaphorically speaking, that doesn't mean they don't need shoes. That means there's a huge opportunity for shoes. Don't worry about how much can they pay, can't they pay, how much do people pay in places where they do wear shoes. The first thing is just identifying, like you said, reframing, identifying the opportunity. And that's partly why we really want to figure out how to get this message out. And at the Institute, we're working on a market creating innovation initiative to really help start to change the way people think about these things.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this last one. One of our participants said, this person from Germany went to different countries in Africa. And this, of course, is not intended to say this actually is a very old story that comes in telegrams going back and forth. It was much more the creating the metaphoric view of how do you see things. And this is something that could be well applied to where my grandparents grew up, a small town in Colombia where you go and somebody said, why don't we do this program with digital solution? I said, no, because nobody here has computers. And I said, no, they don't have computers yet. And I think this, so it was completely metaphorical. Could be Colombia, could be Boyacá, where I come from, could be shoes, could be, so it's not intended to talk, but yes, about the difference of culture that sees opportunities where they say, and something that you mentioned that I loved, and it's why the shoe thing with Germany works so well, or the computers in my hometown works, is no, they don't have the money to pay to expensive shoes. So immediately you take yourself out because they don't have the money. And that is what makes the example so attractive. I said, don't get yourself out of what they need by thinking that the only way that you're going to provide is the way that other people are getting it. Exactly. And I think this is one absolutely spectacular piece of what you're putting here is do not repeat that the solutions that people are thriving for have to be solved in the great way that you know it. And I think that is the other part.
Exactly. If we looked at computers and said, mainframe computers cost $1 million, nobody can afford it, we would not have innovated. I think that's where innovation comes in. If I could just, I know it's 4 o'clock, if I could leave you, innovation is the way we'll figure out a solution. Identify the problem first, identify the struggle. That's step one. And then step two, now let's get dirty and let's figure out, okay, how do we do this? You test, iterate. But if you identify a problem and say, oh, they're too poor, they're too uneducated, they're too this. It's, oh man, that's not the way to do. We're not giving innovation a chance.
Absolutely. And for the audience, and I think this is great, when you pointed out, what are the things that you have to think when bringing people to consumption of what they need? And again, it's not necessarily fancy anything. It's water, it's sanitation, it's everything.
Yeah.
The order in which you put things, is access, time, and then you say money. Money was not the first.
No.
And I would actually put it the fourth. Think about what are the problem of access, what are the problem of time, what skills prevent it, and then money we will find it. There's an expression in the highlands of Colombia, by the way, it says, when you have a problem, do not be concerned about money because there's none. You have to solve it and money will come, which I think is great. I think we're coming to the end of this hour. It has been spectacular. A number of the participants here have been saying, this has been inspiring, this has been opening and there's a number of questions. I really invite you, let's say our audience, to check the book. The book is very, very interesting. It reads very, very well. And the other thing that we talked with him before this conversation, we might try to find some of these training programs that you do, something that we have to explore with our guys in IDB Lab. Because one thing that I have found very, 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 very powerful is people do know what they need, but sometimes it's how you're going to get it that makes it very difficult. And once that you see that somebody has solved the question, that said, I want that. And that creating that combination and putting people sharing struggles and the passion to see them solved is great. It has been an honor to have you here. For me personally, it has been spectacular. But the audience might know that Efosa invite me to lunch when we get out of the COVID. So I see that with hope and enthusiasm. And I hope that we can continue this conversation again. So thank you very, very much. And thank you for our 200 participants to be here today.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
And my colleagues from, I wonder if Irene wants to see something on closing, or you're too much inspired you don't want to close this. I wouldn't myself. Well, so with this, thank you very much. And I invite you to come again to the IDB Lab at the IDB.
Thank you.
Thank you.